Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I welcome you this beautiful spring day, as long as you're not glad we get too cold. So we're so glad to have you here today. To let everyone know, we are producing a video of this program, so that is why you see the camera in the middle of us all. And this will be available on YouTube, so you can catch up with it later on and watch it again and again. We're so pleased to have everyone here today and to have this program that we're sharing with our friends in Andalusia, or my colleague John Vick from Andalusia. The two institutions have enjoyed a long friendship over the years and shared objects and shared experiences and board members, and so it's great that we can do this together. We're very, very appreciative. Our format will really, I'm going to pass the torch to John and sort of facilitate the conversation that's going to occur with our two speakers, but allow me to sort of introduce them all. To my immediate left, what's your name again?
Sandy Koufax.
Tim McGrath. Tim has, I think almost all of you know, is an amazing, amazing individual. I won't even go with the fact that he's a wonderful writer. Okay, Tim. But all kidding aside, this is the man that can quote Jack Kennedy, Sandy Koufax, and make it all make sense out about the second day of Gettysburg in a remarkable way that actually does make sense. And that is a rare gift, my friend. And he is a port warden here at the Independent Seaport Museum. And the Board of Port Wardens is represented today as well by our chairman of the board, Peter Ernst. So, Tim, we're very glad to welcome you as part of the family, but in this case, as a scholar as well.
Thank you, Pete.
Introduce, I don't normally read, but I always hate to mess up somebody's vita. I can wing it with Tim, but I introduce Fred Leiner, who is both a lawyer and a historian, which is, I think, a unique combination, to say the least. His new book, Prisoners of the Bashaw, the 19 Months Captivity of American Sailors in Tripoli, 1803 to 1805. He's the author of two other books, The End of Barbary Terror, America's 1815 War Against the Pirates of North Africa, and Millions for Defense, The Subscription Wars of 1798. He's written many articles on privateering, maritime cases, and the Navy in the Age of Sail. Chairman of the Maritime Committee of the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Adjunct Professor, University of Maryland Carey School of Law, the BA, of course, from the University of Pennsylvania, graduate degree from Cambridge, and a law degree from the University of Virginia. So, very esteemed credentials. I've enjoyed getting to know Fred. Our curator, Craig, asked me to particular note, as he and Fred were downstairs looking, that we have a wonderful exhibition that touches on many of the themes in today's exhibit. So after the program today, we really do encourage you to go on downstairs and enjoy the exhibition as well. So I'm going to pass the proverbial torch.
I think Tim's going to start it off.
Tim, you're going to start? Okay. I don't know if it's on, because I was working without it, so it should be.
Hello. Can everybody hear us? Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Peter, for the kind words. And welcome, Fred and John.
Glad to be here.
So, Fred, tell us, why this story? How did the Barbary States play a part in the birth of the United States Navy? But tell us how you got here with this.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I want to thank both Andalusia and the Independent Seaport Museum for hosting this talk, and also to John and Tim. It's great to be on the same panel with you. So, your question is sort of two parts. One is, why am I interested in this? And the second is, what role did the Barbary powers play in the creation of the Navy? So let's do the second part first. The United States Navy was created directly as a result of the threats from the so-called Barbary pirates. The country gained its independence in 1783 from Britain, and as you all know, the Constitutional Convention met in 1787. So we had a new government at the start of the 1790s. We had literally no Navy. The last ship of the Navy was the Revolutionary War, was the Alliance, which had been sold off. The government was looking around for sources of revenue. There was no money for a Navy, and the idea of building a Navy was contentious. However, then as now, Americans were very entrepreneurial people, and one thing we did very well was shipping, both building ships and in international trade. And from Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Charleston and a lot of other places, our ships went out, including to the Mediterranean. But in the Mediterranean, they faced this historic problem of the Barbary pirates. And so let me sort of talk about that in a little bit of more geographical sense. So Barbary refers to 4 powers along the northern rim of Africa. From west to east, Morocco, which was then and now an independent kingdom. Algiers, which was the strongest of the Barbary powers, which today we call Algeria. Tunis, which is today Tunisia. And finally, Tripoli, which is roughly speaking what Libya is today. Okay, so that's the geography. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, their economies largely depended upon a system of tribute, which is to say, payments in advance from the European countries so that their merchant ships would not be captured. And, of course, the flip side of that coin is if those countries did not pay or did not pay enough, the ships would be captured, and the ships and their crews and passengers would be held for ransom. So it was a very strange world, almost a system, if you will, of taxation for people who wanted to traverse the Mediterranean with their trade. So once the United States became independent and we no longer had the protection of the British, the mother country formerly, we had to make a decision what we were going to do. And as a number of American merchant ships were captured in the 1780s, and approximately 100 Americans, 80 Americans, were held for ransom, the decision was made to build a Navy, and that came in 1794. Now that may have been a very long-winded explanation, but I wanted to sort of set the scene geographically and historically. Now, why am I interested in the specific part of this that I wrote about in Prisoners of the Shah? I like to find aspects that may have been written about, but I try to bring a different focus or a different attention to them. And I believe it's true that my book, my new book, is the first time that the focus is on the existence of the prisoners from the frigate Philadelphia,
Right.
which ran aground off of Tripoli at the last day of October 1803. I have to say, in getting to the museum today, I drove by the Old Swedes Church, which is about 3/4 of a mile south of us. And why do I raise that? Because in the very famous Birch print in 1798, Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia, built the frigate Philadelphia just south of where the Old Swedes Church is. And if you know where I'm talking about, kind of see some nodding of heads. Okay, good. So for me, that's sort of like the holy grail for the frigate Philadelphia. And I passed by that today, I just wanted to comment. So in finding this topic, it was a topic that although the grounding of the Philadelphia is mentioned in all of the naval histories of the war, what really happened to the officers and men in captivity was not the focus of any previous work.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming out today. It's great to be part of this panel. Just to explain my presence here, Andalusia is a historic house that's up the Delaware River, and A family member of the residents there was, at the time, a midshipman who was aboard the Philadelphia when the boat ran aground and was captured. His name was James Biddle. He was a midshipman then, later became a captain and a commodore, and the Seaport Museum has really wonderfully brought out some things from their collection. A presentation sword that belonged to James Biddle, and a hand-colored print of him as well. So that's there's a long history of collaboration and partnership between our organizations, but here it's specifically around one individual, one of many individuals who were aboard the ship. And for me, that's sort of what brought me into this episode. But what I find really compelling about the book is that it provides a really broad treatment. It looks at the experiences and the lives of not just the officers, but the Marines and the sailors, as well as those who were from the Barbary States and the negotiators from other European countries as well. And we'll get into that. But I want to start with a question for the audience's sake, perhaps, as well as mine, just sort of about some of the logistics of travel in the age of sail, right? Which is, a great, very evocative term for this period. You mentioned the Barbary pirates, and obviously they're having an impact and they're collecting tribute, or trying to, not just from the new United States, but from other countries. Countries and powers like France, Spain, Great Britain, the kingdoms of what are today Italy. But those powers are much more closely located geographically to the Barbary States. The United States, on the other hand, is across the Atlantic. I think it'd be helpful to think about and to hear you talk a little bit about, like, how long did a transatlantic journey take and how much supplies were kept. So if someone was shipping through the Mediterranean, or later we'll talk about blockades, how long could a ship just hang out in the Mediterranean and keep a blockade? Because one of the things about your book is it draws out all these wonderful details about the time spent offshore, the various raids. You have a great chapter about the raid of the Philadelphia, and so forth. And it's really helpful to know some of these details about the ships and the timing and so forth. So could you talk a little bit about some of that?
Sure. It's a great question. We, of course, live in our own age, and we're used to instantaneous communications and very rapid transport. Now, you need to use your historical imagination and put yourself back at a time where both communications and transport were only as good as the wind. Think about that for a second. So, to give a very specific example to answer one of your specific questions, John, the Philadelphia made what was considered a very quick transit to Gibraltar, which is, of course, at the start of the Mediterranean. It sailed from Philadelphia and then actually stopped for a couple of days outside of Delaware to water. But it made that trip in 26 days. That was a fast passage. Philadelphia was a fast ship. It was routine sailing east for that voyage to take weeks longer than that. It was uncertain. You could not plan, okay, I know the ship's going to get there next Friday, kind of thing. It got there when it got there. Going west was much more arduous and difficult because of the prevailing winds. And I talk about this in the book at some length. When the Philadelphia grounded, the other ship that was nearby in the Mediterranean was called the Vixen, the schooner. And the commander of the Vixen said, "This is really important news. I've got to find the commodore of the squadron to tell him, and if I can't, I'm going to sail all the way back to the United States because the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, needs to know about this right away." So the captain of the Vixen was a man named John Smith, and Smith started to sail from Malta, heading west, and he couldn't get to Gibraltar. He got about a third of the way, took him several weeks, and he turned around because the winds were just blowing in his face the entire time. And just to emphasize this point even more, when the new Commodore Edward Preble, a famous name in American history, when Preble decided to send the word home, he sent it in quadruple sets of dispatches. And he gave the official set to a midshipman named Gadsden, the son of the signer of the Declaration. And the best he could do sailing from the Mediterranean was on a ship to South Carolina. So he didn't even get the word to the United States first. The word to the United States got there through foreign newspapers which had reported the story. So the communications at the time were very uncertain. Everything was windborne, and therefore, by our standards, incredibly slow and uncertain. Now, to answer another part of your question, John, the ships were surprisingly independent. They could last for weeks, even months, without being resupplied. The critical things for ships in those days were wood and water. They were severely limited by the need to get fresh water. So once the squadron was assembled in the Mediterranean, they used the British naval base at Malta for most of their supplies. There were such things as store ships in those days, but even so, they could bring out gunpowder, they could bring out more men, they could bring out canvas, sails, but the water supply was really the limiting factor. And of course, there are very famous stories of captains who had reduced the amount of water each man could have every day to try to prolong the time on station, or if they were hopelessly behind schedule and needed to sail, so much further. The men did not live in luxury. They didn't have a lot of water to begin with, so to go on half rations and water was a tremendous privation. But there were stories where they were down to a quart of water per man per day. And think about that if you're out in the heat next time. Anyway, have I answered the question,
No,
John?
that was great. Thank you.
Okay.
You might think we're passing a microphone, but secretly we're working on getting ready for the pen relays next month. So Fred, tell us about the Philadelphia, how she was built and how she was seized.
Well, my first book was about the building of the subscription warships in 1798, including the Philadelphia. So the Philadelphia was built during a war scare with France in the summer, starting in the summer of 1798. It's a wonderful story. It's not in this book, it's in the earlier book. But basically, well-to-do people in Philadelphia, some very famous old families, the names many of you would recognize, got together and they contributed the money to actually buy a ship for the Navy, in exchange for which they got 6% stock, what we today would call bonds, redeemable at the pleasure of the government. So what basically happened is the government, from many of the ports up and down the Atlantic coast, got a Navy that was financed by private citizens. It's a remarkable achievement. And the Philadelphia was built in Joshua Humphrey's shipyard, which, as I mentioned before, was very close, just south of where the Old Swedes Church is. Beautiful ship, 36-gun frigate, majestic ship, fast. Humphreys was known for his good designs. He had earlier built the frigate United States, which was the very first commissioned warship the United States built from scratch, as opposed to brought in from the merchant fleet. So the Philadelphia had some service in the first couple of squadrons that were sent to the Mediterranean to deal with the Barbary pirates. We entered war with them in May 1801 because our tribute payments were in arrears, and the Bashaw of Tripoli, a man named Yusuf Karamanli, decided that what we were paying wasn't enough, even though by treaty he had forsworn any additional money. So he amped up the demands. The United States didn't really respond to him, and he chopped down. He had a flagpole at the U.S. Consul House in Tripoli chopped down, which is a really interesting symbolic way of declaring war. And the United States sent over a squadron in 1801, achieved some positive things. Squadron in 1802 that was really aimless cruising, thank you. And then in 1803, sent over yet a third annual squadron. Philadelphia was essentially the lead ship of that squadron. And when it got to the Mediterranean, its commander, William Bainbridge, was another very famous name in American history, naval history. There's a Bainbridge Street in Philadelphia. Was ordered to begin the new blockade of Tripoli. So the Philadelphia sailed, stopped at Malta, and then arrived off the coast of Tripoli. And at the end of October of 1803, saw a Vick Corsair. You have a great exhibit downstairs that has a model of a Vick, incidentally. A Vick is a very distinctive kind of craft, characteristic of the Barbary regimes. Anyway, Bainbridge spotted this, a lookout spotted it on Philadelphia. They gave chase, and the Philadelphia ran aground. There's a lot to be told in that story. The Philadelphia did not have a chart of the entrances to the entrance to Tripoli, and one could question the judgment of a captain, bowling along this frigate at 7 or 8 knots in what was for him uncharted waters. But nevertheless, that's what happened. The Philadelphia ran on the Caliusa Reef, about 3 or 4 miles outside of Tripoli. Bainbridge made desperate efforts to get the ship off the rocks. None of them worked, and gunboats came out from the port, started firing on Philadelphia, and late in the afternoon on October 31st, 1803, Bainbridge decided to surrender. And so he gave up all 307 people on board the ship, and it became the greatest foreign hostage crisis that the new country had ever faced.
Yeah, it's a dramatic telling book, and from there. Sorry to just keep asking questions and giving it to you, because you're doing the lion's share of the talking, but you wrote a book, so that's
That's what I'm here
that's
for.
what happens. It's curious to think about Bainbridge's decision to surrender, which I'd like to hear a little bit more about from you, for the audience's sake, in terms of, did he resist, how much did he fight back, etc. And then also thinking about that decision relative to what then becomes a very different situation for the imprisoned men, whether they were an officer or whether they were, because the consequences of that surrender were very different depending on your status in the ship.
Well, Bainbridge was desperate to get the ship off the rocks. Are any of you sailors? Show of hands, anyone who's a sailor? Have you ever run aground?
Yes.
Have you run aground on mud or on rocks?
Both.
Mud is not a big problem.
No.
Rocks are a big problem.
Yes.
Should we have a digression and let Tim tell us about it?
No.
Okay.
We'll be here a year.
So when the Philadelphia ran aground, and it's the illustration on the front cover of the book, an artist sort of pastels affected the engraving. But anyway, the ship was aground to about a third of its length and was canted, heeled, way over on its side. And one of the things that a captain or commander of a vessel that runs aground tries to do is lighten his ship. So the Bainbridge, pumped out the bilges. He had the men push the guns down this sloping deck and throw the guns. When I say guns, I don't mean like pistols and rifles. I mean the cannon, each of which weighed more than a ton. He tipped them over, had them tipped overboard, almost all of the cannon, to try to frantically lighten the ship. And he did all sorts of other things. Finally, as the afternoon wore on and as the Philadelphia came under fire, he had the foremast chopped down. Can you imagine that? There are 3 masts on the ship, foremast, mainmast, mizzenmast, and he has the foremast chopped down, just desperately trying to lighten the ship. And that didn't work either. Now, could there have been other things that he tried to do? Yes. they were suggested to him, one of them at least, and he thought that, and this was called a maneuver called kedging, which is essentially to take one of the boats, ship's boats, a launch or a barge, and put an anchor on it, and put the anchor directly astern, have it hold into the ground, and then have the men, by brute strength on the capstan, pull the ship off the rocks, if you will. Am I explaining this clearly?
Like a big winch.
Okay, fair enough. But he said, no, that idea doesn't make sense. I'm not sure we can get an anchor on. The anchors are so heavy, I'm not sure that the boats will accommodate them. But even if they could, these gunboats will see what we're doing, these Tripolitan gunboats, and they'll kill all the people. Could he have tried to do that? Yes. There are other things for which he was criticized. So one of the eyewitness participants was a Marine private named William Ray. And Ray comments that Ray's an interesting guy, very difficult man, contrarian, but he had made a very interesting point here. He said that the men's blood was up. They wanted to fight, even without their cannon. And this is a Navy crew. There are 40 Marines on board. And they have muskets, and they have pistols, and they have boarding axes. There's a great boarding axe in the collection downstairs. Swords. And they could have potentially kept anyone trying to get on the ship. I mean, literally, physically trying to clamber aboard. They could have tried to keep them off at least for a day or two, because strange things happen at sea. You never know. Perhaps a friendly ship could have showed up. Perhaps there would be a gale of wind. Now, I'm not saying that Bainbridge could have predicted any of this. There was no telegraph or radio. He didn't know that there was a friendly ship, and there wasn't a friendly ship, as a matter of fact. And he didn't have a meteorological report. He doesn't have one of these great cell phones where you can get data and tell you what the weather's going to be like tomorrow. But he could have tried to hold out, and he did not. And interestingly enough, within 48 hours of the ship seemingly so hopelessly aground, there was an enormous gale of wind that did blow the ship off the rocks. And the Tripolitans took the Philadelphia, which they renamed the Gift of Allah, and they brought it into Tripoli harbor. And they found the cannon, which had been thrown overboard. They sent divers down to get the cannon, and they remounted them on the ship, which became a very dangerous situation for the Americans, because all of a sudden it suggested that the whole balance of power in the Mediterranean might change. Have I answered that question thoroughly?
Yeah, definitely.
Tim, do you have anything to add to that?
No, sounds good. So news finally reaches Jefferson Congress about Philadelphia. Can you put us in the president's mansion with Jefferson, what he was about to, how he was going to react to that, and also in Congress and what their opinions were?
All right, so earlier I mentioned that it took months for the information to get back to the United States. So the information gets to Washington, D.C. in March of 1804. And I said that Philadelphia ran aground at the very end of October of 1803. So that's November, December, January, February. We're into the 5th month by the time the word gets to Washington. And this is an inflection point, because the administration has to decide what to do. Theoretically, they could have decided to put a lot more money on the table to try to ransom the prisoners immediately. They didn't. They decided to take the Navy, they didn't call it mothballs at the time, but the word they used at the time was the ships were inordinary, which means they were dismasted and neglected in various ports. But they brought a lot of ships back in to commission, and Congress passed a special law called the Mediterranean Fund that allowed the government to either spend or borrow up to $1 million, which was a lot of money in those days. If you look at $1 million, it's like, well, that's nothing. but it was a lot of money then, and to support the enlargement of the Navy. So those ships needed time to be readied, and there had to be crews that were enlisted and Marines that were drilled and sent to each ship. So those ships in the reinforcing squadron under a man named Samuel Barron only arrived in the Mediterranean towards the end of the summer of 1804. Now, if you think back, that's 9 or 10 months after the Philadelphia was run aground. That's the best our country could do to send reinforcements. By that time, two things had happened. One, immediately before those reinforcing ships arrived, the squadron offshore under Edward Preble had engaged Tripoli. We had rented mortar boats, which fired these long-range, what today we would call a standoff weapon. These mortar balls, that would explode into Tripoli because we wanted to sort of send that message that we were going to flatten the city. And the smaller ships of the squadron engaged with the Tripolitan gunboats. These are very famous incidents out of American naval history. It didn't change the diplomatic situation much. This book is partly maritime history, but it's also a prisoner of war story. It's a diplomatic history. It's a social history, if you will. So as soon as the men were captured, they were treated as slave laborers, almost biblical in its essence. They were pack animals. They carried stone and masonry to build walls and housing, fortifications around the city of Tripoli. They did heavy labor. Interestingly enough, they have camels. They have donkeys. They didn't use them. They used slaves for this heavy labor. A few of the men on board who were what were called mechanics, the coopers and the armorers and the sailmaker were used in those capacities down in the Navy Yard that Tripoli had. But most of them every day had this really difficult labor. They were poorly fed, a diet that was very small and very high in carbohydrates, very little protein. I go into great detail about this in the book. Their clothes became threadbare. Their shoes were destroyed. They were dirty. And it's a miracle that they did not get any of the terrible diseases that plagued Barbary. I mean, this is the time of the plague. Again, it sounds very biblical, but just a few years before, approximately a quarter, maybe a third of the population of Tripoli had been killed by the plague. But that did not happen. Now, the officers, from the time they were captured, were treated very differently. They were treated as gentlemen. They actually had their own establishment in the old U.S. consul house. And the Danish consul, a tremendous saintly man named Nicholas Nissen, provided them food every day. Fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, tea occasionally. And they had a pretty good life for the first 4 months because as gentlemen, they did not have to work. Now that all changed when after Decatur burned the Philadelphia. After that, the Bashaw rethought the situation. Yusuf Karamanli is the Bashaw. And he had the Americans put into a dungeon underneath the Bashaw's palace. It was dark, hot, claustrophobic, just a terrible situation. And he only allowed them out for air. They had one grated window. He only allowed them out to walk in the orchards and gardens immediately outside of Tripoli periodically, half a dozen times. And those officers were in that situation for 15 months. And so it's interesting to contrast. Towards the beginning of their captivity, one of the officers wrote home that that lifestyle suited him. You know, he was having good food. He was not having to work. He was, walking around the consul house. It was okay. He was with his brother officers. Towards the end, when they're in this dungeon, a midshipman from Philadelphia named James Renshaw wrote that they, and not the men, they were the real slaves. Because yes, the men may not have been fed well, and they may have been beaten, and they were beaten a lot, the men. But they got to be outside, they got to use their muscles, they had fresh air. And the real slavery, according to Renshaw, was being in this dark, gloomy place for months at a time. And it's interesting, the psychology of that, I'm not saying he's wrong, incidentally. It's very interesting that by the end of their captivity, both the sailors and the Marines and the officers regarded themselves as slaves, but for very different reasons.
Thank you for that. I mean, that is really the crux of the book, is sort of that experience that these different individuals had in their captivity and the way it evolved over time. I mean, I love towards the end of the book, or maybe it's three-quarters of the way through, where you talk about how some of the men who are being forced to do the slave labor during the bombardment of Tripoli are made to carry ammunition and gunpowder on their backs to arm the cannons that are firing back at the U.S. forces. And just thinking about these men running around as these, these human powder kegs, right? And had any of them been hit, what would happen? I'm curious, why did the Bashaw respect that hierarchy of officer versus non-officer? Why did he create those different groups where there was different treatment for the men? Was it some sort of acknowledgement that that was a hierarchy that existed in European and American service, and that he needed to follow it? Was it a negotiation tool? Why follow that hierarchy when, in theory, he could have done whatever he wanted? He could put them all in one room. What do you think? Because I imagine you might not know, right? Because you can't read into the mind of the Shaw necessarily. But do you have any ideas why there is that separation, and what his motivation in particular would have been?
I think it's a great question, and I can give you a guess, a hypothesis, but I don't know. I mean, the real answer is I don't know. I think he was respecting Western European conventions, that officers were gentlemen. Gentlemen did not necessarily have to use their hands in physical labor. And his overarching concern, this is really an important point, that guided American diplomacy to try to free these men, and everything about their captivity. Unlike World War II, or the Vietnam War, or what's happening in Ukraine now, although these men were prisoners of war, yes, they were, no question about it, they were not being held for strictly military reasons. They were being held for money. So the Bashaw, one of his great incentives throughout this period, with the Americans and with other slaves that he had, was how much are they worth trading back. So, as a matter of theory, the ship's boys are worth a hell of a lot less than the captain of the ship. So, does this fit in with a model that he wants to sort of treat them a little bit more special and let them have better food and not make them work? Well, maybe. I'm not sure there's a direct correlation in that, but it strikes me that they were treated better, and my instinct tells me that the money is at the root cause of it.
And can I ask a follow-up? Do you mind, Tim?
No.
So this goes back to the topic of communication and how news of this spread. Some of the officers were able to send letters, and they were able to at least try to communicate, whether they did successfully or not. It was a matter of luck, perhaps. But
the sort of creative methods that were used for communicating by the people who were in prison?
It's a great question. So one of the advantages to doing research in our modern day is access to the internet, and with it, all sorts of newspapers at the time. Because what happened was that the officers, many of the officers, would write their loved ones at home, and the letters took forever to get back to America. But an officer could live in upstate New York, or in Philadelphia, or in Baltimore, wherever they might live. And the family, after reading the letter, often, not always, would give it to a local newspaper, which would print an excerpt, because this was news, what was happening. This was a headline kind of idea for America. You know, a lot of you will remember the 1979 hostage crisis in Iran, and how it was every night Ted Koppel was on TV, and it was, you know, on the front page, I'm sure, of the Philadelphia Inquirer, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Well, is the equivalent in those days. This was an enormous story. So when the officers would write home, these letters would give not only their family members, but the newspaper audience some idea of what was going on. So I was able to access letters that pretty much no one had seen for 200 years. And they're not all published in the Philadelphia newspapers. They're published scattered around the country. Now, there are almost no letters from the men, and there's a reason for that. It's not any kind of discrimination. Most scholars think that only about a third of the men were literate. And even at that, what does that really mean? Does that mean they could read the Bible? Maybe. Does it mean they could sign their name and know that that was their name and not much more than that? Perhaps. So it's very shaky, but certainly a majority of the sailors and Marines were not letter writers. Now, there are two other questions, I think, John, that you want me to respond. One is, why would the Bashaw allow these letters to go out? And how did they go out? Well, towards the beginning of captivity, the Bashaw knew that about these letters, and it was fine with him. And it was fine with him, who knows why. It may be that he was trying to drum up sympathy for the hostages, the captives, and therefore the amount of ransom might go up if the American population, you know, says to itself, "Oh my gosh, these people are in such terrible situation." But beyond that, the Bashaw was a very shrewd guy. We haven't talked about him at all, but he was a autocrat but shrewd, a good judge of people. And my bet is that he had his ministers read the letters before they went out. Why? To glean any intelligence that these captives might have about what's going on offshore, about, are they planning to have a revolt and try to, you know, take over or to, you know, kill me? I mean, for whatever reasons, I think these letters were probably opened and read. Now, once the officers were in the dungeon, the Bashaw severely limited the types of letters that could go out. Specifically, he did not want communications between Bainbridge, the captain, and Preble offshore. Beforehand, he had allowed those. Surprisingly, he had allowed those. Afterwards, no. And so, with the help of Nicholas Nissen, the Danish consul, the Americans came up with an ingenious system to maintain communications. Nissen had provided the American officers with books, many of which were their own books that had been pillaged when the Philadelphia ran aground. But Nissen bought them all at the market, the souk, and given them back to the Americans. Now, when they're in the dungeon, Nissen acts as a one-man lending library, and he brings in these books through his man. He brings in these books. What happens is the Americans devise a system of today what we would call a dust jacket, where Bainbridge would write a letter and fold it with the writing on the inside, if you will, and the plain paper on the outside of the book, and have it passed out to Nissen for transmission to the squadron. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? And this sounds rudimentary. I mean, you know, how could that possibly work? Well, it did work. There's no, we have no notion that any of these letters were intercepted and or destroyed because they would pass intelligence or anything else. So there was this system devised to get around the limitations placed on communications. But to your overall point, there were letters published in American newspapers from the officers. They're a great source of information. There are also some letters, you know, in archives and historical societies scattered around the country, but most of them were published in newspapers.
Stay with the newspapers, Fred. Were they able to persuade or push policy with their publishing of the letters, and also any editorializing that they did about prisoners?
Well, that's a fine question, Tim. The newspapers in those days were really divided. A lot of them backed the Federalist Party, which was anti-Jefferson, and a number of them, of course, backed the Jefferson Party, the Republicans, what today would be called the Democrats. And so initially the coverage broke along partisan lines because the Federalists could not believe that there was this one ship that ran on the rocks outside of Tripoli. You know, how could it be that the administration would send one ship? Now, of course, it came out that Bainbridge had chased this ship and had ordered the Vixen away when he could have kept the Vixen near him. But at least initially, there was this partisan flavor to things. Quickly, the country rallied around the plight of these captives, and there's no, as far as I can figure out, there's no divide between how the more Federalist-leaning papers look at these poor men and how the Republican papers do. Now, there were some newspapers that wanted the country to pay more to ransom the prisoners rather than less. And there was the question about the use of force compared to paying money. Now, this is all up to a balance because the administration thought the more force you use, the less money we're going to have to pay. And that makes sense. Of course, the contrary argument is you pay more to free these people, and therefore they don't run the risk of dying from the plague or having Bashaw cut their heads off, because he could have had that done. So there's this moral hazard if you don't spend the money to free them soon. And there was some divide as to how that should work. I should say that, and I'm going to cut to the chase, ultimately we did ransom these prisoners for $60,000, which is roughly $200 per person, which was far less than the initial demands, but we still ransomed them. And many people at the time thought this was a success, but there were a lot of people at the time, and it would still be true today, I'm sure, that complained that we shouldn't have spent any money to ransom them. We should have used the military option and pushed that until the Bashaw cried uncle and just gave these prisoners back. Now, you can form your own judgments about this. I try to be very even-handed about this in the book, but my personal view aligns with President Jefferson, which was that the United States made the best deal it could at the best possible time. And we can go into that if you'd like later. Did I answer your question? Okay. John, back to you.
Yeah, this is something that we had chatted about before when we were planning to talk. I hadn't planned on asking it, but it's coming up now. Ultimately, they are ransomed, but it takes a long period of time. And as you would imagine today as well, while the government is making their efforts and while you have these negotiations going on and these efforts to bombard Tripoli to sort of force the Bashaw's hand in some sense, or at least change the balance of power with negotiations, especially with the officers, some of them come from powerful, wealthy, established families. And just as ships were being built by public subscription, there was also non-governmental efforts, or at least ideas for how you might free the hostages. Can you talk a little bit about some of that? So what was happening outside of the government's control to resolve the situation?
John, I'm glad you asked that. It actually opens a very interesting view about America and about these people. So when the word first got to the United States, there was an effort based in Philadelphia. Former Congressman Thomas Fitzsimmons led the effort to raise money because his view, based on the centuries of barbary enslavement of Europeans and even Americans in the last generation, was that we've got to get these people out just as soon as possible. This is horrible. And the administration, in the form of the Secretary of State James Madison, said, you can't do that. Please don't do that. Don't try to do that, because you're going to set a hugely bad precedent for our dealings with this part of the world. And now, again, you can argue the judgment on that, but that was the judgment. And I dare say that would be the kind of judgment that American politicians and diplomats might make today. So Fitzsimmons and his nascent effort to privately subscribe a huge amount of money across the country to get these men out immediately, that died slowly. But the interesting thing, as your question suggested, John, was that there were officers whose families had the means to privately ransom. And this is very interesting, and this goes to James Biddle specifically. I use James Biddle as an example in the book. As I'm sure you're aware, the Biddle family of Philadelphia is then and now a prominent family. James Biddle's father was Charles Biddle, who pretty much knew everyone in revolutionary America, including George Washington. Matter of fact, through the help of the Andalusia House and its collections, it turns out that one of James Biddle's 20 years old. It turns out that one of his correspondents in captivity was the Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr. So that we're starting at that level. Anyway, Charles Biddle, through both the British consul, the American consul in Tunis, and through the British governor of Malta, put lines of credit money up to privately ransom his son. It would have been enough money for James Biddle to say, yeah, I have a get out of jail free card, and I want out of here. And you couldn't blame him if he did that. But strikingly, the officers on their first day of captivity made a pact. And if this reminds you of John McCain and James Stockdale, it should. They said that none of us should leave until all of us can leave. It's a hugely important precedent. It was a matter of honor to these people that it doesn't matter if our families get us out, we're not leaving until all of us leave. And I think that it was rather heroic. Now, Biddle's not the only one, but I use him as an example. The other officers talk about this agreement. I think it's a really significant point when people are captive in a really alien country. They have no idea. Now, we know in hindsight that their captivity was going to end. They were living through it. They didn't know if they were going to live or die. And for them to have this sense of honor that they were all going to stay and see it out, see it through, until the country would either come to their rescue or get them out, I think is a really important statement about them.
I just want to add as a plug for Andalusia, we open our visitor season this Saturday, but we have a display room about Commodore James Biddle, and there are drawings that an artist did of his life, and the drawing of his captivity is maybe my favorite because it's just a wall with a prison door. You don't actually see the Commodore, so the joke is that he's somewhere in there, he's in prison. Of course, this is just, you know, a made-up drawing that the artist did decades later, recounting his story, at which point he's a commander and a very high figure. So they have all the recounting of his like later, you know, episodes of heroics and so forth and things. But then also the story of him as a midshipman, and it's just a wall with a door that's locked. Tim.
All right, I've got two questions. Non-related, but I know we're probably getting to the winding down stage. Were there any attempts to escape? And then the second one I wanted to ask you, Fred, is if you could fill in a little bit about Commodore Preble and William Eaton.
Keep that in mind because I'm going to do the escape question first, and I may forget. So another thing that the officers had done when they first were in captivity is they made a deal with the Bashaw. This was a time where honor was held out as the most critical thing for officers. And their deal was that they would not try to escape, in exchange for which the Bashaw was going to give them freedom to walk about the city, you know, to go to the market if they wanted. And, you know, they promised not to escape, but they could sort of, you know, be out and about, if you will. The Bashaw immediately reneged on that deal. We can get into the reasons for that, but the Bashaw reneged on that deal. And so therefore the officers thought, well, our parole of honor no longer exists. So they were allowed, in their own minds, now they can escape. They could not, it was not feasible to escape from the consul house, but when they were in the dungeon, they tried. It's remarkable. They tried again and again and again, 3 or 4 times. And they had very few digging tools. I mean, it was like digging with spoons kind of thing. And the Bashaw's castle is right on the waterline. It's right off the harbor. Matter of fact, one of the illustrations in the book is of the ruins of the Bashaw's castle, which still exist in Tripoli. And the part that isn't ruined is the National Museum of Libya. And I joked, I wonder if the dungeon has been open to tourists, but well, I doubt it. But anyway, so they're next to the harbor, next to the the water table, and they're in a dungeon. And they nevertheless try to dig their way out to get to the water. And there are obvious engineering problems with this. Like, what do you do with the displaced sand? The water's coming in. They don't have pumps, of course. So one of their efforts was fruitless. Then they tried to come up with other efforts to go up and out of this one window that they have. And they actually filed down the bars on the window, and they had this elaborate plan that they put into execution, but they had to call it off. Anyway, they made valiant efforts to try to escape. This is an important facet of the ethos of officers, especially, but men, the enlisted people as well, in captivity. They have an obligation to try to get back to American lines, kind of thing. And they felt this obligation in those days as well. And they did try to escape. Now, remind me, what was your first question?
The other question was about Commodore Preble and about William.
All right, so Preble's the commander offshore. He's a great naval officer. If you go to Annapolis, there's a Preble Hall. The Navy doesn't like naming buildings after officers who aren't exemplars. And he was a disciplinarian, but a real leader. And he did what he could with the resources that he had. However, I show in the book, again, I try not to be too judgmental. I let the participants speak for themselves. But he was not a very good diplomat. And there are a lot of things that he did wrong. One of the things that was remarkable is after almost each bombardment, he would raise the white flag to show that he was willing to talk with the Bashaw, and then he would raise, not lower, raise the amount he was willing to ransom. And the other diplomats, the foreign diplomats, were like, how can you do this? You're pounding them. If anything, you should lower the demand, not raise the demand. So the Bashaw was perplexed by this, and it was not a very good negotiating tool. There are other things that probably did wrong. William Eden had been a diplomat in Barbary, and then he went back to the United States, and he got support for the idea of finding one of Yusuf's brothers, who arguably was the rightful ruler of Tripoli, but had been essentially deposed by Yusuf. And he was somewhere in the Nile Delta. And Eden goes off and he finds him. And then, this is just a tremendous episode, Eden essentially makes himself the generalissimo of this motley crew of Arab horsemen, Greek mercenaries who are Christian, and 8, not 9, not 10, 8 U.S. Marines. And they start this march from the Nile towards Tripoli. That's 1,000 miles of almost entirely Sahara desert. They were doing this, obviously there were people on horses, but most of them are on foot. Just think about that. They get about halfway, and they have a pitched battle at a town called Derna on the Mediterranean. They manage to beat an overwhelming force that the Bashaw has sent. And then they hold the city when there's a counterattack. Eden's wounded, a couple of Marines are killed. And incidentally, in the Marine Corps anthem, where there's this line, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, when you hear the shores of Tripoli, you should think about this. That's what this refers to, this expedition by William Eden. Anyway, one of the anomalies about the book, that I point out in the book, is that during this incredible march across the desert, where there's this revolt of the Arabs who are supposed to be working for reinstalling the brother on the throne, and just terrible things happening, word filters back to the American naval officers in Malta, and they're like, okay, this is not going to work. And so they decide to dispatch the head American diplomat, Tobias Lear, to try to conclude the treaty, because we've been fighting these people for years now, and you've got to work out a deal. So the Americans perceive this expedition as failing. The Bashaw sees his brother approaching with this foreign army and holding the town of Derna, and he sees this as an existential threat to his regime. He sees this as a success. So all of a sudden, the Americans, thinking that their ace in the hole is, a busted flush, if you don't mind me mixing my card metaphors, and so they're willing to deal more aggressively, and Bashaw is willing to deal more aggressively because he thinks, okay, I got this real problem brewing on my eastern flank. And so they concluded this treaty. I mentioned the $60,000 and the return of the prisoners that Preble's squadron had captured, etc. They were able to conclude that very quickly in June of 1805, with the effect that almost all of these Americans got to go home. Now, I will just say, you didn't ask this, but this is the perfect time, since this is pretty much the end of the presentation. 5 of the Americans had become Muslim. And I'm not an expert of the Quran, but I understand that one of the teachings of the Quran is that one Muslim cannot enslave another Muslim. So these 5 men got out of their captivity by, in the pejorative phrase that was used by the Americans at the time, turning Turk. That was what they said. So these 5 guys, there were 5 men, none of the officers, 5 of the sailors died in captivity, and 2 more right after captivity. And obviously they were dying while they were enslaved. So essentially 7 of the men did not make it home. Crazily, 2 of the men decided, after spending 19 months in captivity as Americans, they said they claimed to actually be French citizens. And they went to the French consul for protection, and he gave them protection, and whatever happened to them, nobody knows. So all the officers, and 264, I think it is, men, well, maybe it's 250 on the nose, eventually made their way home. But to show you how precarious things were in the Barbary world, I mentioned that 5 of the men had turned Muslim. And as the treaty was concluded, the Bashaw brought them into his chamber, personally. And he asked each of the men, do you want to stay here with me in Tripoli, or do you want to go home? And 4 of the 5 said, oh, we want to go home. One of them, a man whose name was John Wilson, although it's not his real name, it's an alias, he was a smart guy. And John Wilson said he loved being a Muslim. He hated being his former life as a Christian. He loved the Bashaw. What good was America to him? He just wanted to stay and serve the Bashaw for the rest of his life. What did the Bashaw do? He welcomed John Wilson, and he had the other 4 driven out into the desert. And there's no further record of what happened to them, but we can guess what happened to them. So once you decided to go over to the other side, there was really no sense in trying to turn back.
I mean, that's a fun and grim way to end it, with being driven out in the desert. I think we should ask some questions, or see if anyone in the audience has questions.
Well, I'll end on a happier note.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, I like it dark, that's fine.
No. It is too dark. It is too dark. So I'll tell you one of the things that I thought was remarkable, and this comes up at the very end of their captivity. The men find out that they're going to be freed, and obviously they all get drunk and have a great time. But they say, they write to Bainbridge in a letter, that there's been one overseer, a Neapolitan slave, who has treated them kindly for the 19 months that they've been in captivity. One guy. I wish I could tell you his name, but he's come down in history nameless. And the men say to Bainbridge, dock our pay. We want to buy this man's freedom. It's a remarkable story that when it got back to the United States, this too was in almost every newspaper in the country as an example of the spirit of American sailors. And yes, they spent the money, their own money, to free this one guy, and this one guy was treated as a guest on an American warship and sent back to Naples, presumably to his family. So that's a better way to end the story with the beneficence of the American sailors. Do we have questions? I welcome as many questions as you may have. Anyone? Okay. Yes, sir.
So this is, this all kind of happened at a time when the U.S. was really just trying to establish itself, right? And so it was kind of acting internationally. And I wonder, how did this fit into maybe a global political ecosystem, or at the very least a European one? How did this kind of play out? Did it represent something? Did it forward America, or just how did it fit?
That's a really interesting question. It's a provocative question. And the answer is, I think it showed the European powers that in its own way, America was willing to exert force if necessary. Here, our country, 4,000 or more miles away from Tripoli, and we dispatched pretty much our entire Navy to deal with this problem and spend a lot of money. And I think the willingness to do that was meant to send a message to the other countries of Europe. It also showed them that at least the United States was not willing to arbitrarily pay more tribute. One of the cardinal rules of America then and now is sort of free navigation. There are rules, international rules, and countries should be able to trade without pirates. Countries should, etc. You can imagine. So I think those messages were important. Now, history is not linear, and Thomas Jefferson was no friend of the Navy. And so after the Navy sort of came home, he resorted to, the Navy was mostly gunboats for coastal defense. And all these ships, he sort of dismasted and put back in ordinary. So the message was perhaps muted or mixed. But I think the message that we were trying to convey is that the United States was now emerging, not as a power. We couldn't compete really with the French and the British, but we were, they couldn't discount us. If provoked, we would respond. That's the best I can do to answer that question. Tim, you have any thoughts?
Makes perfect sense. You did.
John? Yes, sir.
Oh, I'm just asking, so not much later than this time period, the war as well occurs. So what impact does this have on society that affects that conflict? Where a similar situation occurs with the British take American sailors, forcing them to work on ships. How did that affect public sentiment towards that?
Well, so the impressment of sailors by the British was a thorn in American sides. It actually preceded the Barbary Wars and continued after the Barbary Wars. But fighting the British was a lot different than fighting Tripoli. Tripoli was a small and fairly weak Mediterranean power. The Britain was the great superpower of the day, had by far the largest navy, and was a real threat to the United States, or at least perceived as a threat to the United States. So you didn't want to take on the British lightly. I think that Americans were obviously dramatically opposed to the practice of impressment. And if you look at the newspapers in the first decade of the 19th century, there are all these little sort of sidebars about, Elisha Smith of Newburyport was seized by the British frigate, whatever, off the merchant ship. And, every issue has people being seized and taken. And I think that obviously was not lost on the American public. I mean, you certainly unanimously know. What to do about it was another story. And there were attempts to negotiate a diplomatic solution that didn't work. I think the real effect, however, is not really on society. I think the real effect here was training a generation of American naval officers. There's a famous historian from 70 years ago who entitled his book Preble's Boys, Fletcher Pratt. And I think that captures it. I mean, Preble happened to be the squadron commander at a formative time for all of these young officers in the Mediterranean. And the way they operated was very important as a learning process for what would happen in the War of 1812. Many of them, including Decatur, were important figures in that war. And the sense of discipline and order and how you did things, I think Preble set a lot of those standards. That's the best I can do to answer that question.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
How did the American public balance or respond to the concept of enslavement of white people versus the enslavement of Africans in the country?
That's a great question. So for purposes of the video, let me I should have repeated the other questions. The response of the American public to the idea of American sailors held as slaves abroad while Americans enslaved black people, particularly in the South. It's a very interesting question, and it's a very complicated question. And there is an answer. So it's going to surprise you in some respects. For one thing, there's no question that there were black men serving as sailors on the Philadelphia. So even though the mindset of the administration were these were white Christian people, they were not all white Christian people. There were some black sailors. We really don't know how many, because one of the interesting things about the Navy at this time is it was not the Jim Crow Navy. They literally did not account for the race or color of the sailors in any of the muster rolls. So we don't know. I was lucky in my research, I say lucky in quotation marks, for Philadelphia and almost no other place. There still survives records of something called the Seamen's Protection Certificates. So this was before there were passports. And of course, this is before biometric data, before photography. So the best the United States could do was for sailors was to give them an identification paper that the mayor of Philadelphia, for instance, might attest to, saying that Joe Blow, who is 6 feet tall and has a crucifix on his tattoo on his left shoulder and whatever descriptors they can put in, is a legitimate American sailor. So you British shouldn't impress him, and he's bona fide. And we know that from the period of 1797 to when the Philadelphia sailed in 1803, we know that there were somewhat less than 800 sailors enrolled in Philadelphia who had Seamen's Protection Certificates. 1/6 of them were black. Now, it's not necessarily a correlation to say, okay, well, therefore 1/6 of the sailors on the Philadelphia were black. That's probably overstates it. Ironically, many of the sailors on the Philadelphia were not Americans. I mean, get your hands around that for a second. They were Irish and English, and it was a surprisingly cosmopolitan world where sailors didn't think twice about saying, well, I'm American, and they'll sign up on an American warship, and then they might desert and join a British warship or whatever. So, but my point is, on the one hand, not all of these captives are white, the Philadelphia captives. But to answer your question directly, yes, the anomaly, and maybe you want to use the word hypocrisy, of trying to rescue what may be Americans overseas who are held by a darker skinned country, Muslim country, when we had millions of black people enslaved in this country, some of whom were Muslim, was not lost on all the newspapers. Now, I haven't seen it in any of the southern newspapers, but there were some, and I touch on this in the book, there were some northern newspapers that questioned how we could be doing this. At the same time that one state of the Union, South Carolina, still legally allowed the importation of black Africans as slaves. The other states had, as a matter of state policy or state law, had gotten rid of it. And of course, the Congress, our Congress, got rid of it in 1808, which was 5 years after the Philadelphia McGrath. So yes, there was commentary about it. I even cite a poem that was written about this anomaly of how can we enslave people in this country and bring even more people in when we are crying about the mistreatment of our people in Africa. It was obviously not a majority feeling. This is, almost 60 years before the Civil War, but the comments were made. Yes.
I've got one last question for you. First
How are the
off,
Phillies going to do?
if you know that, I'll go to bed now. But first, to thank John and certainly Fred, thank you for coming up here and enlightening us on what's been a terrific story and a really wonderful book.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
I want to leave you with one question. I'm teeing it up for you. I remember reading how John Adams, when he was finding out about the initial seizure of American ships before our Navy, made the comment during the possibility of question of war with the Barbary pirates, that he said, if we determine we must fight them, we must determine to fight them forever. And I couple that with Harry Truman's comment that the only thing new is the history we don't know. That said, what do you think are our lessons, or what can we learn from prisoners in Bashaw that you've uncovered, and how it still reverberates today?
Well, there's perhaps a easy foreign policy lesson, which is, despite what you read and hear all the time, that, and you've heard it, I've heard it, America does not pay ransom for hostages. It's a cardinal principle of American diplomacy. Well, this episode is often cited incorrectly as one of the great examples. We did pay ransom. And one of the points of the book is not that you should automatically pay ransom. Of course you shouldn't do that. But in the appropriate situation, you cannot or should not categorically rule that out. There may be situations where money does talk, and maybe that's a lesson. Now, I was asked in a talk that I gave whether or not we could have tried this with the Iranians in 1979, and I don't think so. I mean, history doesn't repeat itself so exactly. I think the Iranians were not interested in money at all. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be certain situations where money is a lubricant. But that's one area. I think there are lessons also in how the humanity of these people in captivity. I refer to the officers with their pact of not leaving until all of them can leave. I think that's a tremendous moral story. I think the men paying their own money to free a captive Neapolitan says a lot about them. I think that there were a lot of stories, no point going into them here. There are many little vignettes in the book that shows the humanity of the sailors. And I think it's remarkable. I would like to think it's an American characteristic. Perhaps I'm giving us too much credit in that regard. But there's some human aspects to the story that I think are timeless. So I don't want this just to be seen as a maritime story, as a diplomatic story. I think this is almost a morality play in some ways. Maybe I'm reading too much into my own work.
Not at all. Not at all.
John.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Fred, and thank